Peter, it's a pleasure to have you on today. Thank you for joining.
You're most welcome. Great to be here.
You've had a profound impact on my life, and we're in a place that shaped me, and it's really meaningful. As you founded the Heschel School, we're sitting in the Heschel School, and Peter Geffen, you also founded Kivunim, which was the most formative year of my life, a year thinking about what it means to be a good person in this world, discovering the self, asking questions. So it's meaningful to be here, and I really, really appreciate you joining me.
I'm honored to be here.
Thank you. I guess we'll start with your own foundation and thinking about your family. What were the main values that were taught, the principles that your parents tried to give you, and maybe one thing that you took from your mother and from your father in terms of your character?
So my father grew up in Atlanta, Georgia. He was one of 8 children of Rabbi Tobias Geffen, who was the sort of chief rabbi of the South, so-called. And he was a Southerner, right? He grew up in Atlanta. But when he was probably in his 20s, he came north because, as he would tell me later on as a child, he couldn't stand riding on segregated buses. He couldn't stand the prejudice against black people. And that was probably the most profound, lesson that I received from him, because it was not a topic of conversation in the houses of my friends in growing up in Forest Hills in the 1950s and 60s. Into the 60s, yes, but when I was a kid, that was not a topic of conversation in anybody else's house.
Do you remember being like 5 and having that first conversation, or it was just?
It was not when I was 5. It was my father. My father was a storyteller, so he would tell stories about his childhood, and in those stories were woven these sets of values.
Is there one that stands out that you've told your kids many times that was?
No, it was not a particular. It was woven into his stories of his youth and his childhood. It was just part of it. The one story I actually heard from his youngest brother, from my Uncle Abe, who was in Atlanta at the time of the Leo Frank trial, and when Leo Frank was ultimately lynched, by this mob. So down the street from where my grandfather and grandmother lived, where the family lived, there was a guy on the street who was a member of the Ku Klux Klan and who was there at the lynching. And he hung a branch with Frank's blood still on it on the porch of his house. And my Uncle Abe remembers as a child walking to school and have to walk past that house, and he knew, what this was.
So who Leo Frank is, for people who might not know.
So Leo Frank was a falsely accused Jewish man in Atlanta who became involved in a horrible case where he was where a young girl had been raped and murdered in a pencil factory in Atlanta, and Frank worked as a night watchman or something in this factory, and he was accused of having committed a ritual murder, and he was tried, and he was thrown in jail, and in a fear that he would be let go, this mob of the Ku Klux Klan broke into the jail and took him out and lynched him.
Wow.
A Southern lynching is in front of a crowd. It's not like done in secret. It's done in front of a crowd of men, women, children. It's quite something. It's a famous story.
And your uncle walked by this every day. I'm sure that had a deep impact on him.
So had a great deep impact upon him. But the power of that story is that part of my father's background. On the one hand, the family lived in Atlanta, and they were respected and had a wonderful experience in Atlanta. My Uncle Joel was the first Jewish student at Emory University, and my father went to Emory. All my uncles and aunts, almost everyone went to Emory. It was, they were part of the Atlanta story. But my father was deeply affected by racism. And in fact, the most telling part is that when he came to New York, by the time I was a child, you couldn't tell that he was a Southern. All of my other 7 aunts and uncles spoke with a real thick Southern accent, and you could tell right away that they were certainly from the South. And if you knew a little bit more, you'd know they were from Atlanta. But not my father. My father spoke like a Northerner. He just dropped the accent because he didn't want to be associated with that whole world.
And in some ways, it goes full circle when you go down to Atlanta for Martin Luther King's funeral, because that's where your family's from. And in many ways, that starts pieces of your life that maybe you could piece together looking back. But could you share a little about being at the funeral? And I know there's a funny story with the mule, but also the impactful piece of walking.
Well, I mean, I would start before the funeral is when Dr. King was alive. So how did I become a civil rights worker really is the important background. So in the summer of 1964, I was in Israel on a summer program, and we were working on a kibbutz. In those days, that was part of the experience. And working on a kibbutz was not easy. You worked either in the cow shed, which really stunk, or you worked in the chicken coop, which was even worse. So one day, my friends and I, we decided we're going to pretend to be sick and we're going to stay in our bunks. And we had a shortwave radio. We're listening to a Yankee game. And over the news, in between, the hours of the game, we hear that the bodies of the 3 civil rights workers, Mickey Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andrew Goodman, had been discovered in a red clay dam in Mississippi. This is 1964. So Andy Goodman was my classmate at Queens College. So when I came home, I said to my father, next summer, 65, I'm going to go and replace Andy in the civil rights.
Was there fear? Were you afraid for yourself, knowing what had happened?
I remember I'm a teenager. I was not afraid of at all. My father said, "Oh no, you're not." I said, "Oh yes, I am." He said, "Oh no, you're not. This is I know what that Klan will do, and it's too dangerous." And I said, "But this is what you taught me my whole childhood, my whole life." And that was the end of the discussion.
Literally.
Yeah, that was it. He realized that all those stories that he told, which included, in all the good stuff, it included these stories about what the South was really like. They had left a profound effect. So in 1965 and 1966, I worked for Dr. King in Orangeburg, South Carolina, and that's how my association with Dr. King existed. In the summer of 65, at the end of the summer, we had a meeting with Dr. King, all the volunteers from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in Atlanta in the Ebenezer Baptist Church. And it was during the break at lunchtime when the church was not air conditioned, and Atlanta in August is
cold,
abominable. It's terrible. We walked out the back door, my friend Mickey Schur and I and Dr. King, and there was a guy standing with a Polaroid camera. And Mickey said, "Would you take our picture?" And the guy said, "Sure." He took our picture. And then Dr. King said, "Well, may I autograph that picture?" And so that original Polaroid has on its back, "Best wishes and thanks for your help, Martin Luther King," which is really, the sort of most treasured possession that Mickey and I, both have. He is now an Orthodox rabbi, Rabbi Moshe Schur. And so that's the starting point of your question of a couple of minutes ago.
Maybe before we get to his funeral then, I think King feels far from a lot of people a great man, this person who, even though it's not so long ago, if you were born in the last 30 years, you might feel like a distant memory in some ways. Is there something you feel we should hold or we could integrate in our lives as an average person to live in King's footsteps?
So first of all, your assumption is interesting. Here at the Heschel School, we're meeting in the Heschel School building every year, not only on King Day, but around King Day. We have a whole series of programs from the children in early childhood, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, all the way through to the upper years of high school. And what's most powerful is if you come to an elementary school assembly, all these years later, when we put on the screen Dr. King's, the end of his I Have a Dream speech, everybody from the littlest 6-year-old, everybody's silent. The little ones don't really know what he's talking about, but they know that they're in the presence of someone and something very important and really great. And as they grow older, in this school, they learn the significance of his work for America and for humanity, and they carry it with them. So when they get to high school, and certainly when they get onto college campuses, his life and his values are a part of them. Now, you asked, what would I recommend? So what I would recommend are the words of Abraham Joshua Heschel introducing Dr. King 1 month before he was assassinated at the Concord Hotel in Kiamisha Lake, New York, at the annual convention of the Rabbinical Assembly of America. They were celebrating Heschel's 60th birthday, I think a year late. And
celebrate the whole year.
Yeah. And they had asked Heschel who he wanted to have as the speaker for this event. And Heschel said, I want Martin Luther King. They expected, I'm sure, that he would mention some rabbi, but he said, I want Martin Luther King to come and speak, and I, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, I want to introduce him. And when he stood up to introduce him, I was in that audience. He included the following words. He said, Martin Luther King is a voice, a vision, and a way. Martin Luther King is a sign that God has not forsaken the United States of America. I call upon every Jew to follow in his path, to heed his word. The whole future of America will depend upon Martin Luther King.
And I guess the question there is that feels somewhat far away because he's such a big figure and it's such a huge impact. When we're thinking day to day, month to month, we're living in New York, we're living in Atlanta, wherever we are, what should we do to integrate that, not just in thought, but in a meaningful way as
well?
well?
The first thing is Martin Luther King was 39 when he was shot. He was 25 when he took over the church in Montgomery, Alabama, and began to lead what became the Montgomery bus boycott. So that means that you don't have to be a seasoned, experienced, middle-aged, or older person in order to lead and in order to have the power of your ideas heard by people who are both younger than you and older than you. The key piece is to act. So that's the first thing.
Just
Dr.
do
King,
something.
Well, I don't want to say do something because then it sounds too trivial. You have to do something of deeper meaning. You have to look at the needs of the time in which you're living, and you have to stand up. And there's a courage involved because there will always be opposition. In the case of Dr. King, there will be violent opposition, but you have to stand up. Otherwise, there will be no change. And that's number one. Number two, he was an extraordinarily modest person. Like, take that story I just told about the picture. He didn't have to say, may I autograph that picture? And if he did say, may I autograph the picture, he didn't have to say, with best wishes and thanks for your help. He had a quality of recognizing the humanity of the people that he was in the presence of, even though they were not him. They were not his peers. We were not his peers. We were a bunch of, just out of teens.
Have you ever seen someone cultivate that skill where they didn't start with some innate humility, but they worked on themselves to recognize that every human being is a wonderful human being?
I'm not sure that I've seen people move from a lack of humility to humility. I've seen people move from the passivity that may also accompany humility into activism that is accompanied by that humility. Yeah,
Right.
that I've seen.
So we're now back in Atlanta, and Martin Luther King Jr. has been assassinated, and you go down. And there are two stories, one with a mule. I'd love to hear...
There are actually three.
Three stories. I'd love to hear what happened with the mule and what did Abraham Joshua Heschel say to you?
Okay. So it is 1968, April 4th. Dr. King has been shot. My friend in the photograph that I just spoke about, Mickey, and I, we're still technically members of the staff of the SCLC. We get on a plane, we fly to Atlanta. We stay at my grandfather's house. And we immediately go to the Ebenezer Baptist Church. We find our supervisor, Hosea Williams, and Andy Young, and we want to help. We want to help. There's going to be a lot of help needed because you have thousands of people coming from all over the world. In 1968, there are no bottles of water to buy, and there are no cell phones to use. So you really need to both protect and serve all these people who are coming. So our first job was to go to the airport and pick up Rabbi Heschel on the night before the funeral, a few days after his assassination, and to bring him to Coretta Scott King. She wanted to talk with him. She had asked Heschel to participate in the funeral service, which he did, and she wanted to talk with him about what he wanted to read or what he wanted to do. The second job happened early in the morning, but it has a background. All these pieces are not, but just by themselves. So when John Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, on the plane back from Dallas with the body, Jackie Kennedy had the presence of mind to have her assistant call the Smithsonian Museum and ask them to take out from the museum the wagon, the caisson, on which was borne Abraham Lincoln's body when he was taken from Washington to Springfield, Illinois, where he was buried. It was a beautiful black lacquered wagon, and in the case of Lincoln, it was drawn by six white horses, beautiful white horses, and a black horse, unbridled, that was attached to the side of the six with a saddle, no bridle, but a saddle with boots in it facing backwards, which is the symbol of a fallen soldier. And that horse, as the wagon train is moving, pulls away and is a symbol as well of the rupture that had occurred to the country. So she wanted her husband, John Kennedy's body, to be borne on that same wagon from the Capitol where it laid in state. By the way, Mickey and I passed through the Capitol the Sunday night, I think, of before the funeral on Monday. Wow. And she wanted the body to be borne on that caisson with six white horses and the whole scene to the National Cathedral where the funeral was, and then to Arlington where he was buried. So the story is that in 1963, Dr. King is watching this on television with Coretta. He's 34 years old, and he says to her, Corey, I am not going to live out the days of my life. And when I die, I want to be buried the way the poorest black sharecropper is buried. No fancy wagon, certainly no hearse, just a simple wooden farm wagon, not pulled by beautiful horses, but by mules, the simplest farm animal. So on the night before the funeral, in the middle of the night, one of the two mules had arrived from a farm in the area, but the second wasn't there. So Reverend Hosea Williams came out and he said, Mickey, Peter, go with this farmer to his farm and help him get a mule onto his truck and bring it back as fast as you can, because we have to have this all ready by 9 o'clock when Dr. King's funeral begins and when the coffin will be taken out of the church and put on a wagon, because right now we've only got one of those two mules. So we did so. Now the story, as the years went by, did sound to me a little fantastic, like I made this story up. But in fact, a reporter from the Christian Science Monitor, when he heard this command, he followed us and jumped on the truck as well and did a whole interview and wrote a whole story that appeared, I think it appeared on Monday, on the day of the funeral. And it exists. The story exists. So we know the story's true because it actually happened. And there was a record made of it. So that's the story of the mule. And the third story is that everyone, all the staff members, we created a line of honor from the church door to the wagon when the funeral was over. And then we were all assigned to walk next to some of these international dignitaries in case they needed anything, in case there was a problem of any sort. So Mickey and I were assigned to walk next to Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, obviously, and Senator Bobby Kennedy. And of course, Bobby Kennedy would be dead 2 months later. I mean, it's like really unbelievable. And as we were walking, this is 1968, so I was 22, Mickey was 23, and our hero, John Kennedy, had been assassinated 5 years earlier. Now Dr. King is shot. We're the kids. And at a certain point as we're walking, I sort of turned to Rabbi Heschel and I said, sort of threw my hands up in the air and I said, Rabbi Heschel, what are we to do now? And he didn't answer. He kept walking. And then at a certain point he turned around and he said, you must teach the children, you must teach them a Judaism that can remake the world. And then he kept going, walked on. And I was 22, went in one ear, went out the other. And then on the 20th anniversary of his death in 1992, we were sitting in the old Heschel School building, planning an observance of his death anniversary, of his yard site as it's known, and I had a flashback to this sentence or two, and it was pretty powerful. I mean, I wouldn't say that I did what he said, but I certainly have tried to do what he said.
What is that Judaism for you? What does it mean to teach that Judaism for?
So I think, Heschel himself says all of the religions of the world teach a similar value, the value of human life, and a commitment to better the life not only of yourself but of other people. V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself, is in Leviticus. It has a slightly different form in the New Testament, I think in the book of Matthew. And similar teachings exist in the traditions of the religions all over the world. We're given a direction in those teachings that we're going to face people, situations, governments, policies, which are going to go counter to those values, that are going to seek to take away from people, to take away life, to take away quality of life, to take away medical care, to all the things that we constantly run up against. The teachings of Judaism, of the Torah, and of its sister religions, and of the religions of the East, are to counter those negative forces, those forces that work against human values and the respect for human life, with a deep regard and concern for making life better for people, to build peace, and justice, and fairness, and compassion as the cardinal virtues of the world. And that process is not overnight, and it's not over a generation, and it's not over a millennia. It carries with it from the beginning. That's why the book of Genesis opens with a story of two brothers, one of whom kills the other, because there's a dark side to the human experience, and it does not go away. It's always there. We're living through it right now in Trump and Putin and Netanyahu and probably a bunch of people that I don't even know in other parts of the world. Our job is to counter that.
I think two things that really touched me in this lesson adjacent. One, the idea that every human being, as you've pointed to with King already, but every human being has the ability to make a difference in this world. And it could be the smallest scale where someone's having a tough day and you just say, "How are you?" and you listen. Or it could be something that impacts millions of people, but recognizing not only that we can create good, but individually we can create good. And that was really powerful for me. And I think another thing, and I'm curious if you feel an adjacency, is the importance on questions. Would you say that's also a piece in questioning the world around you?
Okay, so that's in a different arena. In other words, how does one grow and learn? For example, how does one understand what compassion is? How do you learn these things? And by the way, in the Hebrew language, the word for compassion is rachabim, and rechem is a womb. So the language tells you right away that in the situation in life where you have no responsibility, where you are completely taken care of, where everything is provided, that is sort of the ultimate setting of compassion. It's your ability to step into the other's shoes and recognize that you, and conceivably only you, can exert and design and imagine the care that person or situation needs. That's what compassion is really all about. It's a big, big word. So for sure, the most powerful way to get a person to be a compassionate human being is how you teach them. And the question of how you teach, so many people, including many teachers, think the way you teach is like you give a lecture and you dictate. But the question, the way you're asking me, the question that you're asking me about the question, is that the only way in which people are really going to absorb into their heart and soul, into their very being, is if they're exploring through the power of the question and not through the power of figuring out what's the answer to X, Y, and Z. The question allows me to challenge the world around me, to try and figure out, how do those two pieces go together? How, like people at the moment are bewildered. How is it possible to have a world with such cruelty that we see on television every day and believe that there is a more positive possibility on the other side? How's that possible? That's a question.
How can you hold those together, though? How could you, do you have advice for someone who struggles where they only are able to focus on one and being able to say, no, they exist side by side? Like, have you done anything in your life to feel both at the same time, to experience both at the same time, or do you segment your mind in some ways?
No, I think what you're really asking is about faith. If you're a person who believes in these higher values, that has to mobilize all of your energy. It doesn't mean that you don't recognize the realities that are around you, but it infuses you with a belief and a faith that down the road, your action, the action of your friends and your peers, will produce change. That's Dr. King's lesson for sure.
Right. So I guess one piece that I want to focus on questions, because it totally changed my life, was in the first week of Kivunim. We were sitting in a circle, and you recognized that some people were looking at your leg. And you said to all of us, you said, is anyone going to ask what happened to my leg? And we all turn away, embarrassed, to look further and to think about asking. And you quote this book called The Ascent of Man, about scientific progress about humankind. And you say, don't ask a pertinent question, don't get a pertinent answer. And then you said, most people in life want to speak about their experience. And if they don't, they'll say, I don't want to talk about that. And that's okay. And that gave the license, I think, to all of us to feel like we could ask really powerful, maybe not expected, maybe not within social norm questions interpersonally and more broadly. Do you think there's a way that someone can learn how to ask good questions? Is it just by doing it? Like, how did you become a good questioner? And how do you teach others to not just be willing to ask, but to ask the right questions?
Okay, so first of all, the quote is, if you are not willing to ask the impertinent question, you will never arrive at the pertinent answer, which is different than what you said. So that's number one. But you're asking a very big question. So we have to start with how most education works. Most education works with a fascination, a concentration, I would say, on answers. So most kids learn from the time that they're very little. Number one, when the teacher asks a question, you put your hand up, whether you know the answer or you don't know the answer. Because the worst that happens is when they call on you and you don't know the answer, you'll say, I forgot. And that's a scene you can see in classrooms probably all over the world, but certainly all over America. That's number one. On the other hand, you are also given the sense that if you ask questions, that's a disruption to the flow of the class. So it's very common to have a teacher say, Johnny, not now. Okay, that's just, maybe later you can ask me, not now, because Johnny asks too many questions. So we're fighting against the norm, the norm. And of course, there's no meaning in an answer to which you don't know the question that it's answering. So the critical piece, and it's not a very difficult thing to do, is to be creating an opportunity in classrooms for children to be constantly asking questions. Now, look, this is not some genius of mine. A chemistry lab, a biology lab, they are made up of situations which are exactly that. That's how we teach science, through questions. For some reason, in the social sciences, we have moved to a place where we give accurate information and we expect you to give it back to us. And that is not a way to internalize and to learn. You've got to apply the same scientific method as you do in the sciences to the humanities as well.
But let's say I'm 18, I started on Kivunim, and I've had the wrong training. And now I'm like, okay, I personally, as an individual, I want to learn how to ask better questions. How can I do it? Is it just ask as many questions as you can, or like?
Well, first of all, your class can be conducted with a ongoing series of can't only be questions, obviously, but every piece of information that's being communicated can be preceded by a critical, serious, big question. So then as a student, I begin to see how significant the framing of the question is to the arriving at the answer. That the answer, that's number one. Number two, the answer has to be complex, sophisticated, nuanced. It has to draw from many sources. It has to indicate that the question asked, which the teacher has asked, requires a complex process in order to arrive at an answer, instead of just parroting. The teacher in the end would be parroting an answer that they got from some book that they read or some lecture that they heard. So the question becomes a critical part of the process of modeling the way in which one really effectively learns. And from a Jewish point of view, our classical sources are only studied by questions. The Talmud is just an ongoing series of exchanges between different people who challenge each other in the facts, which is just another way of asking a question.
Right. And I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't ask, what happened to your leg, and how did you overcome this really life-changing event?
So in 1994, on January 9th, there was an ice storm in New York. We have never had one since, and I don't recall one ever before, meaning not hail, but actual ice coming from the sky onto the ground and freezing the roads, the windshields of cars, and of course people. So it was a Friday afternoon. I left the Heschel School with my son Daniel and a friend of his, also named Daniel. They were in the back seat of our car. I was in the front seat. I parked in front of our house on the Central Park West side of Central Park West. I opened the door to the back seat to get my briefcase. The kids had gotten off out on the sidewalk side. And a car was driving up Central Park West, but they couldn't see, because the windshield wipers don't work if the windshields are frozen. The windshield wipers are frozen as well. So she should have been 15 feet to her left driving uptown, and she was instead 15 feet to her right, meaning she was driving right along the edge of all those cars. And when she got to me, she hit me. And luckily, she was going probably 20 miles an hour, fast enough to do a lot of damage, but not fast enough to knock me completely off. I grabbed the sort of upper part of the door, the inside of the door of the car, so I didn't fall under her wheels. And after she had passed, I then let myself down onto the ground. And the ice on the ground cauterized part of the wound, so I didn't bleed out on the ground. The doorman from my building, who was a wonderful man, came, put his winter coat over me, and they called ambulances, and I sent my son Dan, said, go up and get your mom, get Ima. I didn't know what had happened, but I knew that I was in pretty bad shape. And it took a long time for the ambulance to come, but it got there. They took me to what was then St. Luke's, now Mount Sinai, Upper West Side. And over probably several hours, I'm not aware of exactly how long that process was, the doctors basically said to my wife, said to me, but I was already, in shock and could not really understand what they were talking about, that there were two choices. They could amputate my leg, I would get a prosthetic leg, and I'd be up and walking in a month and a half. Or they could operate, and I would probably have to come back for many subsequent operations on nerves and muscle and whatever. And after all that, there was no guarantee that I would really be able to have a functioning leg, but they certainly could try. But their recommendation was, so my wife Susie called many of our doctor friends and asked people's advice, and everybody agreed that amputation was the better route. So that was it. When I woke up in the recovery room, I said, this is part of the answer to how did I handle this, I said to the nurse, well, I guess I've just reduced my athlete's foot and mosquito bites by 50%.
Wow.
And that was my approach to this.
Were there moments where it was a lot harder and you had lost something you'd had your whole life and you had to remind yourself of that mindset? Or do you feel it was pervasive enough in your life that you didn't, oh God, why did this happen to me? Like, did you ever experience anything in that
No.
vein? No, not once.
No.
Wow.
No. In other words, but that's just part of my nature. In other words, I didn't like create that. That's just part of who I am. I'm a very optimistic person. And they said you'll get a prosthetic leg and you'll be able to walk. I'll tell you a funny story, which was that when I began, I was in the hospital for 2 weeks. Then I began physical therapy, and then which I did at the hospital for special surgery. And then I was introduced to the prostheticist at the hospital and began working towards getting a prosthetic leg, which was probably 3 months after the accident. So when I began even the physical therapy, the therapist said, we like to have a therapeutic goal, and we look for something that physical that you did, as part of your life before you lost your leg. Is there something like that you could tell us about that we could work towards? So I said, well, my family and I have climbed the mountain Masada in Israel every year for the last many years. That's a very physical goal. Now, at the time, my daughter Nessa was 5 years old, and she was coming to all these sessions because we wanted her to, to sort of feel that I was okay. So I'm sure the therapist looked at this 5-year-old, and he's talking about climbing some mountain, but what he really means is, like a hill in Central Park. That's a great. So Jimmy Muska said to me, when do you do that? I said, normally in July. She said, oh, that's perfect. That's perfect. July, you'll be ready. Invite some of your friends, and you'll climb this mountain together. She had no idea what she was talking about. I had no idea whether this was something realistic or not. So we invited a bunch of our friends in Israel, and on July 10th, 1994, we set out to climb the snake path of Masada, which we did. And we have a movie of this climb. And what's funny about it is that when I came back, I showed it to Jimmy, the head of PT at HSS, and Glenn Garrison, who was the prostheticist. And they, of course, practically had a heart attack because they were, as they saw me walking around the curves where there's no bar and no nothing, and we're going straight up, they were having a little bit of a nervous breakdown as to what might have happened if I'd fallen off that mountain,
Wow.
And I did that with Kivunim several times over the course of the years, probably every 4 or 5 years, until I was, I think, maybe the last time was I was 75 or 73.
That's amazing. So for some people, losing their leg and then learning to live in life might be their greatest undertaking. Feels like for you, maybe it wasn't. Anything you've done, what do you think is the thing that you feel today was your greatest undertaking? And did you know at the time when you started it that that was going to be your life project?
No, and I can't answer the question now. I feel that I've been given a extraordinary privilege to travel around the world, to meet people, to do that in the context of educating extraordinary young people like you. That's and by the way, most people who I often tell a joke that when I'm fundraising for Kivunim, at a certain point, some very wealthy people say to me, "I'm not giving you any more money," and I say, "Why not?" And they say, "Because I have all the money in the world and I can't do what you and your students do," which is true. In other words, they can't take a year and travel around the world. So so I consider, the effort that's involved has been part of the privilege, to be given the opportunity to do what I've done from very early on. When I was hired at the Park Avenue Synagogue, I was 21 years old, and the educational director, Rabbi Joe Wernick, said, look, we just want to keep our bar and bar mitzvah kids involved in the synagogue. You can do whatever you want to do. And whatever you need, just tell us. So that was like incredible. And we built an after-school high school with fabulous young faculty, all of whom were getting PhDs in the Middle East studies, in Bible, in Hebrew language, etc. And we built a travel program in the summer, and we created an extraordinary environment. But the rewards were so powerful that I can't stop to say, like, this was where I really poured out the effort, and therefore, something came back. We're sitting in the Heschel School, with I don't know, a $40-60 million annual budget, where when we started, we couldn't pay the electric bill. So, but that's, I put that in the category of great, opportunity and privilege, but it's not about the work that went into it. Work went into it, without any question. Work went into it. But it's the kind of, my experience was so constantly rewarding. I don't have anything to look back on and say, boy, I'm glad that was over. It's not like that.
One thing that struck me, and it relates to this, is you got some advice that if you do anything publicly, you have to be prepared to take a lot of blows. And I'm sure there were points when you received them, many of them. Did you desensitize yourself in any way, or how did you try to reduce the impact of that pushback on you emotionally and say, okay, I know what my mission is, I'm going to just keep driving forward? Like, did you have any strategies of ways to make those blows a little bit easier?
So look, the story that you're referring to is when what I thought was the logical location of this idea of the Abraham Joshua Heschel School at the Park Avenue Synagogue did not comport with the idea of the majority of the members of its board of trustees. And at that point, my very dear and beloved friend, our former Attorney General Bob Abrams, said to me, look, if you're going to work in the public sphere, then you're going to have ups and downs, and that's it. And if you don't like the ups and downs, then go into business and be your own boss, and then you'll control everything. You'll still have ups and downs, but you'll be responsible for them all. So he was absolutely correct. But the truth is that if I think back, how many moments like that did I have? Very few, very few. When I came to the Park Avenue Synagogue when I was, as I said, 21. So how much could I have known, really? Everybody was warm, welcoming. The parents had, when we suggested that we wanted to take a group to Israel, I had grown to 23. The parents didn't say, 23? Who's supervising this program? Like, you're the age of a participant. Nobody said that. They said, oh, that's fantastic, including like the rabbi's daughter. It wasn't like, some maverick group of parents. The same thing when we opened the Heschel School. People didn't say, I'll tell you about some people who said, but nobody of consequence said, this is not possible to do. People, donors on the one hand, people like Mike and Rhea Gruis and Alan Slifka, really amazing people, they all said, this is a fantastic idea. An idea. It was nothing to show. It wasn't a finished product. It wasn't 2 years later when a donor could come and see a classroom. It wasn't 10 years later when people could see a whole building full of kids. It was right when it was just an idea. These are people who said, go ahead, by all means. You need help. Here's some money.
What was your elevator pitch for this idea that was clearly so powerful you were able to get people to be like, wow, let's run with it?
I think that the pitch was that the Jewish people needs a generation of educated people, and it needs a place where people who are not only Orthodox can go to. The only day schools that existed almost in the whole country were Orthodox day schools. The few that existed that were not Orthodox day schools were conservative day schools, where, once again, it was a sort of, so the Orthodox wouldn't send their kids and the Reform wouldn't send their kids. And of course, the Solomon Schechter schools have suffered in the last 10, 15 years precisely for that reason. We were talking about a school that would have to figure out how to create a climate that would work for everybody. And we had, from the beginning, Orthodox families involved and all the other branches of Judaism and people who were completely secular and had no involvement with any of those branches. And that was critical. It was for the Jewish people. And second of all, that we were committed not to removing our children from the mainstream, but to recognize that taking them out to get a good Jewish education was a compromise, and that the program of the school had to stand for values that America needed to hear. And that's why our association with Heschel and with Dr. King was and is so important, because the assumption of a Jewish school, right or wrong, is that it's only concerned about Jews. And we were building a school that was concerned about the world outside, justice, peace, others. And we've manifested that over the years, imperfectly, but it's been a critical part of what we do.
One thing that's really stayed with me in my personal experience from Heschel, from the person, from the institution, in thinking about how to live a good life, is the idea of radical amazement, and going outside and seeing a sunset and being like, wow, that's stunning, that's gorgeous, and having the space to recognize it. Do you think that there are things personally either that you do or that in your reading you've discovered in Heschel for how the individual can live a good life? And yes, a life of meaning, but are there tangible things that are practicable that Heschel guides people towards in terms of living a purposeful, meaningful life?
Well, one of my favorite stories of Rabbi Heschel is an interviewer, sort of like what you're doing to me. An interviewer was sort of pushing Heschel, and he said to him, Rabbi Heschel, religions are always fighting with each other. Protestants and Catholics in Ireland, Jews and Muslims in the Middle East, Hindus and Muslims in India and Pakistan. Wouldn't it actually be better if there was just one religion in the world? And of course, he was expecting Heschel to say, as a distinguished rabbi, that, well, yes, it would be better if everybody was practicing Judaism. And Heschel looked at him and he said, Mr. Stern, would you want to go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City and see the same painting on every wall in every gallery? The diversity that you see in the world is God's creation, is God's intention. And so therefore, Heschel was teaching from the outset that difference, and even in the realm of religion, was part of the intent of the divine, not a human sort of misdirection, like everybody should be Jewish, but all these aberrations occur. No, not at all. That all that difference that we see is like the difference between human beings, and no two human beings are exactly the same, even identical twins. Imagine that. And our DNA is exactly the same, almost, exactly 97, 98 point something percent, whatever it is. It's incredible. Yet nobody looks the same. All these different colors, different hair, different body shape, different genders. I mean, it's really, the whole thing is unbelievable. Heschel sees that as a manifestation of the intention of the divine. So if you start there, if we were able to teach all the children in the world, and therefore the next generation, to just look at people all over the world and see the beauty in their difference instead of the difference in their difference, the world would be a different place. And one of the most powerful parts of Kivunim is exactly that. We don't even have to talk about it. People begin to become comfortable with difference. They hear different languages. As we travel, they hear different languages. They experience different foods. They see different skin colors. They witness different religions. They experience different climates. They see different geographies. They begin to see the beauty of difference, whereas most people are brought up in such a way that the moment that they encounter the first difference, usually in a restaurant, as a child, they say, ooh, I don't eat that.
Right.
I don't drink that. And it manifests itself in so much of the rest of their life. You have to fight against that tendency. The natural reality of the world in which we live is that you have this magnificent expansion of diversity, of difference. And here we are in America, at a moment when we have a sick president of the United States attacking diversity as a concept. It's a dirty word to him. So that's an indication of how important and urgent Heschel's teachings are, and how privileged all of us who've been involved in Kivunim's travels around the world, have been. Today, some of my closest friends are Moroccan Muslims. 25 years ago, I would never have imagined such a thing as being possible. And it's only through human contact.
Absolutely. Well, I guess in thinking about that balance and thinking about the love of each human being and thinking about what is possible, if you were to think about your whole life, is there an act, a moment, a story that for you personally most embodies? I mean, you've covered so many things in starting school and starting this international program, but embodies for you what the possible is.
Does it have to be limited?
It could be unlimited, but one specific to ground the mind so that we can hold on to, wow, life is full of possibility.
Well, look, if a person is a person of faith, then you do not believe that the world was created in order to destroy itself. Whether it was created scientifically or in some more magical way by a divine fiat like the Torah describes. I'm on the side of the science, which is also a divine fiat, but of a different order. Either way, it wasn't created in order to destroy itself. So therefore, working towards peace has to be imbued with that feeling. You could call it optimism, but I don't think it's a question of optimism. I think it's a reality. David Ben-Gurion has a very famous quote. He said that people who don't believe in miracles are not realists. And he lived his life that way. That's why he went to the desert, where people said it's impossible to live in this place, and created a climate. To this day, most people still believe that it's not a place where people can live. But the people who live in the desert are finding themselves living in a magnificent place and are really making a big contribution to the state of Israel as a result. But that's a very important viewpoint to understand. I don't think you can go through life doing the things that you do with a hesitation as to whether they will be realizable. You have to have I'm not sure what to call it, whether it's faith or conviction, that the things that you believe in, that you're working towards, are going to be realized in your lifetime, even though that may prove not to be correct. So peace is such an example, right? People like me have spent our whole lives working towards peace, and many people say to me, you got to be nuts. Like, why waste your time on this stuff? But I don't believe that the world was created in order to turn itself into ash. And therefore, given the power of the weapons that we now have available to us, I don't believe that they are there in order to self-destruct.
Absolutely.
So I don't think it's not a sort of naive kind of optimism. But on the other hand, it requires human devotion and work in order to get to a point where the world might have the possibility of existing in some kind of peace.
Well, Peter, may we always have the conviction to fight for what is right, to look ahead of us and see a better future and to work towards it. And thank you for being a lifelong educator and for having educated me in so many ways. It's been a real pleasure.
You're welcome. Thank you for the honor of this interview, and I wish you good luck.
Thank you.